I think we'll make a start because we have quite a lot to get through in the next 2 hours. And obviously people will be joining us, so we'll be very welcome to join us as we go along. I hope everybody can hear me. Could somebody indicate thank you? Welcome to this webinar on migration and climate change. My name is Anne Singleton. I'm the Strategic Policy Lead for Migration Mobility's Bristol Specialist Research Institute, and I'm a reader in migration policy. And we've been collaborating between Migration Mobility Bristol and ACH on this series of webinars looking at topics that address policy issues and the way in which academics and the policy world and practitioners can help to try and bridge the gap between research, development and lived experiences. And we're very happy with the way the series is going and the interaction. I should say, first of all, before we start, we're recording this webinar. And if you don't want to be included in the recording, please keep your camera switched off. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. And of course, you're welcome to put questions in the chat. So I hope that we'll be able to respond to everybody's questions and give everyone a chance to talk. First of all, I'd like to ask David Jepson from ACH to introduce ACH and the role of ACH in these webinars and in the city. Thanks, David.
Sure. Sorry, it's 2 seconds. Okay, so I think Anne's already said most of what I would say. ACH is an organisation that works to support the integration and resettlement of refugees and migrants from different communities, primarily in the west of England and the West Midlands. But we're also keen to operate in terms of policy development and research too. And we've been working with the MMB Research Institute in Bristol University for a couple of years now, and have instituted this really successful and interesting seminar series, which, as Anne has already said, aims to bring together people who work in research and people who work in delivery, because it's always seemed to me there's a huge gap in terms of where public policy comes from. And if we don't talk together and interact more frequently and in a more interactive way, then we're not going to end up with areas of policy that work and function for the clients who actually need that support. And this particular one is on migration and climate change, which are clearly 2 huge global issues which are driving change across the world. And it seems to me that we really do need to look at those issues and how they interact and how they intersect, and how we can intervene in policy terms at international level, national level and local level. So it's great to see so many people at this event. I hope it's useful, and I'll pass over now to Anne, who will chair the session.
Thank you very much, David. Could we have the next slide, please? So this slide indicates who is going to be speaking. We've got a wonderful lineup here, and our speakers are going to address some of the issues arising from the complex phenomena involved in looking at migration and climate change, indicating how we might understand some of the policy challenges, some of the human realities and challenges that people face, and how we could work together to find effective ways to deal with the impacts of what is happening, these dynamics of what's happening, particularly in the context of the growing global inequalities and the impacts that these have on human rights. So we're looking at policy issues, legal issues and practical on the ground effective remedies for helping to support and for people to be able to challenge and navigate their own lives through the challenges that we face. The order of speakers will be as follows, as set out there. So first of all, we're going to have just excuse me.
That is USB 5. You've just disconnected USB 5. So what other speakers have you got?
So I can hear somebody speaking that. Is everything technically okay? Yeah. So each panellist is going to speak for around 15 minutes, and we have a joint presentation for two of the speakers. First of all, we'll be hearing from Dr. Laura De Vito, who's a Senior Research Fellow in Geography and Environmental Management at the University of West of England. And she'll be addressing some of the issues that we need to follow around international legal and policy issues around climate justice and the legal challenges. She'll set the scene for the discussions. Then we have a joint presentation from Dr. Catherine Allinson, who's a lecturer in law at the University of Bristol, and her colleague Dr. Alice Venn, who will be also from a lecturer in law at the University of Bristol. And they will be looking at the legal frameworks and the international instruments and the way in which all of these issues are managed in legal situations, and what kind of remedies can be addressed, and the way in which those international instruments can be mobilised to address the challenges of climate change. And then we'll have Tom Dixon, who is the project lead. He leads the projects at ACH and deals with the local impacts and the local ways in which ACH is addressing all of these challenges and the way they work out in people's real lives. So I don't want to dominate this session now. I'm going to hand over straight away to the first speaker. Laura, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, for your introduction. Yes, so today I'm going to give you an overview of climate change policy actions. If you go to the next slide, please, there's an outline more or less of my presentation. So I'm going to explore the links, so the effects of climate change, how it can be relevant from a migration perspective, and reflect on the policy, some of the policy implications, and what kind of actions we can take to address those. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So climate change is defined as a long-term shift in global or regional climate patterns. This is a very famous, very popular visualization of how the temperature has been globally has been warming over the years, and we can see that there is a warming trend. This is a very powerful image that really gives you a sense of the urgency of the impacts of climate change. If you go to the next slide, please. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the most authoritative body that gathers all the science available on climate change and provides also recommendations to policymakers, in its last report last year, probably the most strongly worded one thus far, stated that it is absolutely unequivocal that with our activities, with our productions and behaviors, are having a massive influence on the atmosphere, on the ocean, our oceans, on our land. So human activities are absolutely linked to climate change, and it's absolutely imperative that we take action, that we act with a sense of urgency and real commitment. So if you go to the next slide, please. So how do we characterize climate change actions? How do we understand climate change action? So the way I like to describe it is a set of actions that are part of the two faces of the same coins, or the same coin, really. So there's an adaptation side to it and a mitigation side to it, and I'm going to explain how we can differentiate those and why they're both important. So if you go to the next slide, please. So starting with mitigation. So when we talk about mitigation actions with relation to climate change, we are referring to the efforts to reduce or prevent emissions of greenhouse gases, or to remove these gases from the atmosphere. So this is about dealing with the causes of climate change, which we know it's greenhouse gas emissions. And we're typically, obviously this is not an exhaustive list, but we're typically talking about transport, so the way we move around, energy and heating, which is very pivotal these days. How do we heat our homes? Where the sources of heating are coming from? Also, energy efficiency. How do we minimize the heat loss? How do we make our homes more efficient so that they can retain heat, but also in other from another perspective, also we can keep our houses cool. And waste management. So how do we get rid of our waste? Do we burn it, or do we invest in reusing and recycling? So this is mitigation actions, and you can see how actors at all levels, from national governments to individuals, have got agency, have got the power to do something about it. Next slide, please. And this is also what we refer to when we hear about the net zero goals, the net zero strategies. So we've got a national net zero strategy, but also local net zero strategies. Bristol has got the ambition to become carbon neutral by 2030, and but also organizations, universities, companies can develop their own to contribute to this. So you can see how actions on the mitigation level can be really multi-level and coordinated. Next slide, please. So if you move now on to the other side of climate change action, so the other side of the coin, we know already that climate change is underway, and therefore that its impacts are already felt, in fact, everywhere in the world. I remember when I started studying the issues, they were saying, yeah, it is occurring somewhere else, far away, we can't really see it. But now it is really everywhere. And therefore, we need to be able to deal with these impacts, the effects that climate change is bringing out. And that's what adaptation refers to. So it means anticipating the adverse effects that climate change can bring about in your local area, and taking appropriate actions to prevent or minimize the damage that they can cause, or also in some cases taking advantage of some opportunities that may arise. So it's about reducing the effects of climate change. Mitigation is about the causes. Here is about protecting ourselves, our communities, from the effects, from the impacts. And again, typical sectors, typical areas that we look at water risks, so thinking about the risks from floods, excess waters, but also water scarcity, sea level rising, saline intrusion that can affect groundwaters, and in some areas groundwater is the main source of drinking water resources. For example, the area I come from in southern Italy, that's our main source of water, and saline intrusion is a risk that we have to deal with. More extreme and more frequent weather events, heat waves, we experienced one last summer, severe storms, that can be dealt with, for example, for early warning systems, preparatory plans that can, anticipate and give us a chance to keep us safe. And in general, investing in infrastructure that is adaptive and resilient, and also gives us access to green spaces. For example, here I'm bringing an example of the green infrastructure. If you go to the next slide, please. So green infrastructure, just to give you an example of what adaptation actions could entail. Obviously, this is not the only adaptation solutions, but it's a nice example that can be taken at all levels locally. Here are some examples so green infrastructure is an interconnected network or blue or green systems that are particularly effective with dealing with, for example, excess water or water quality, improving water quality, and it brings about a lot of co-benefits in terms of amenity leisure activities, learning opportunities. And these projects that I've listed here are actually, they go from a really broad city, whole city approaches, like the sponge city example in Wuhan, that basically deals with the excess rainfall, the risks from excess rainfalls, but also very local projects like the First Fund project in Greater London. So these are just examples of what adaptation actions can look like. And why it's important, if you go to the next slide, please, these impacts from climate change have a real, we talk about climate change like it is a global problem, but the effects are felt very, very much locally, and can put pressures on a lot of our supporting system. For example, I'm bringing the example of food security can affect food security or water security, because warmer temperature and climate variability can alter growing season, reducing crop yields and availability of fresh water, increase tree mortality with cascading effects on biodiversity. So there is evidence already that climate change is affecting food security, and particularly in certain regions, many lower latitude regions and drylands. And we also need to consider, to have very clear in mind that the effects of climate change are not felt equally by everyone. There are some groups that will be disproportionately affected, that will be disproportionately more vulnerable to this effect. And that's why it's important to recognize that there is a gender dimension to climate change impact, there is socioeconomic dimensions, and that there is evidence that of these disproportionate effects of climate change. So when we design interventions, these need to be very context specific, come from a very deep knowledge of the landscape, of the social and economic context. It's important that they're participatory and appropriate and inclusive if they want to redress this climate and environmental injustice. Next slide, please. Now, bringing more into together the topic of climate change and migration. So the links between the two phenomena are quite complex, but climate change can affect and can be coupled with key socioeconomic, political, cultural factors that can be linked to migration, but it's not necessarily the case. It's quite again, it's quite complex, and it's not a straightforward relationship. And we also have to bear in mind that different triggers, so different climate events, climate-related triggers can lead to different responses in different areas. So the picture is complicated. However, what I would say is that it is useful to look at migration with all its complexity, and I'm not a migration expert by all means, in the context of environmental degradation and climate change, because the role of these of climate change and environmental degradation is likely to increase in the future. So it's something that that is important to bear in mind and be aware of. Next slide, please. So, for example, is migration a last resort adaptation response? So I think it could be in certain cases. Obviously, it will depend, there will be some variations on whether the climate event, what is causing is a sudden onset event or a more chronic long-term process. So think about the difference between the impacts that a hurricane can have versus coastal erosion. These can influence whether migration, for example, happens at all, or it's temporary or permanent, voluntary or involuntary, internal or international. But there is evidence that For example, there is already a movement from rural areas towards urban areas in the context of environmental degradations. And again, we need to be very aware of local conditions, because it's also true that certain populations who are at risk from climate change and are facing with very immediate threat may also be trapped, may not have the resources to be mobile and to leave. And in these are all the things that governments and local authorities may need to be aware of when they consider the interrelations and the impact that adaptation responses can have on communities. For example, if governments and local authorities decide that they will stop maintaining flood defences against the risk from sea level rising, these may leave some coastal community at the risk of relocation, and that's been happening also in this country. For example, there are some cases for example, Fairborn in Wales, where this announcement then obviously, as you can imagine, has led to a reaction from the local community, and now they're trying to find other solutions other than relocation as an ultimate adaptation response. Also because, you know, it's difficult to quantify and to understand the cost versus the benefits of relocation programs at this scale, and you know it's important to understand the impacts that relocating can have on communities. So it's a very delicate and a very complex type of intervention, but it can be. I think in the context of climate change, migration can be considered as a last resort extreme adaptation option. Next slide, please. So back to the climate change and action and policy. What should we prioritize? So next slide. Next slide, please. So we need to focus on adaptation, even in thinking about these complex issues, because we are falling behind globally, but it's also true in the UK that the the gap between the level of commitment and action that is underway versus the level of risk is widened. That's not my opinion, it's the position of the UK Climate Change Committee. And we are now less prepared for climate change than we were 5 years ago. Next slide, please. So should we focus only on adaptation? No, I think we need to keep working on mitigation as well, because it's the level of actions and the ambitions that we put on mitigation actions will put us on different global warming trajectory and climate change trajectory. So it's a question of degrees. It's not a yes or no answer. So next slide, please. There is a massive difference in the impacts that would be felt whether we are going towards a 4-degree global warming scenario versus a 1.5-degree global warming scenario. So that's why it's important to work on both sides. Adaptation, we need to protect our communities, and mitigation, we need to make sure that the risks are contained and we're dealing with the causes, because it's a matter of degree. So my final slide. So we talked about climate change as a global problem, but the effects are experienced locally and regionally, and we need to be aware of the local context. We need to know the local context. Climate change can interact with other socioeconomic, political, and cultural factors that can be linked to migration, but this relation is not straightforward. Migration can be seen as a last resort adaptation action, but we want to be really more anticipatory, more participatory, rather than reactive to such an extreme. And the final message that I really want to stress and underline in this context is that climate change policy and environmental policies do work, there are technical solutions. We know where the problem is. We know how to deal with it, but we don't implement them enough. And so there are wide range of options that national governments, local authorities, communities, organizations, industries can work towards both net zeros and adaptation goals. And I think I will stop there. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was so clear and very informative. And I'm sure that the slides are going to be very helpful to everyone afterwards and the recording. So that's a great introduction to the topic. Thank you very much for your input there. We've got plenty of questions coming up in the chat, and I'm sure we're going to have a good discussion later on. So if we could move straight on now to Catherine and Alison, who are going to speak about how international law can respond to climate-induced displacement. And as a migration policy expert, I'd like to just throw in that the complexities of understanding migration are equally complex as the ones that we've just heard about in understanding climate change. So the legal challenges are really enormous here. So thank you very much. Catherine's going to speak first. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think we'll probably draw out some of that complexity. So thank you for inviting Alice and I. Our contribution today is going to kind of set out the legal framework and kind of draw out some of the policy complexities that are evident in there. I first wanted to highlight the kind of links between climate change and displacement, but Laura has already done this very clearly. One thing I kind of want to highlight is that this isn't going to be something that will just be affecting developing states. Climate change will have a global impact, and I've actually got a picture here of the Welsh village of Fairborn that is expected by 2054 to no longer be sustainable to live in. But the point that I think is important from a legal perspective, but a policy perspective as well, is that climate change is not going to affect us all equally. It is communities who are already the most vulnerable and who have contributed the least to global emissions that are going to be hit the hardest by climate change impacts. And Laura has already set out that these impacts will result in the movement of people, but how that movement is caused will be complex. We know people will move because people already move as a result of natural disasters. And kind of in setting the scene, the other point I want to draw out for the kind of legal implications of this is that climate change impacts are complex and multiple, and as such, how they contribute to migration and movement will also be complex and multiple. So research has demonstrated that displacement from climate change occurs because it exacerbates existing vulnerabilities and reinforces inequalities like poverty, food insecurity, existing conflict and persecution. But climate change is rarely the sole or primary cause for movement. However, its impacts increase, and we know that as its impacts increase, we know that these will lead to greater levels of movement as vulnerabilities are further exacerbated and inequalities deepen. So climate change will cause movement, but how it does so is far from linear. Next slide, please. Given this, are people moving because of climate change refugees in a legal context, under a legal understanding? The short answer is no, but the longer answer is they can be, but they often won't be. And I'm going to explain briefly why that is. So under Article 1A of the 1951 Refugee Convention, climate-related displacement does not constitute a ground for international protection. A refugee must have a well-founded fear of persecution, and persecution requires an egregious violation of human rights, which is assessed in light of the nature of the right and the severity of the violation. It also requires that the fear of persecution is well-founded. Climate change and the impacts of it are unlikely to fulfill this requirement, despite the detriment it can have on an individual's access to human rights. And as Jane McAdam has highlighted, it's difficult to identify a persecutor that the refugee fears. Instead, many refugees or people moving because of climate change are likely to be moving to states that are actually major greenhouse gas contributors. Persecution must also be related to a reason given by the Convention of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or public opinion. But impacts of climate change do not discriminate upon different groupings. Even if an individual did establish persecution based upon an egregious socioeconomic rights violation caused by climate change, they would then need to argue that this affected them because of their membership of one of these groups. And finally, there's the challenge of temporality. Is the risk imminent or actual? Has it reached the threshold for there to be persecution? Gradual and slow environmental degradation may not be enough, and future harm is also unlikely to be sufficient. So the only situation wherein individuals displaced by climate change may be classified as refugees is if certain groups are persecuted by the state in its response to climate change. For example, if relief or policies are denied to a group based upon a convention reason, or if climate change impacts exacerbate violence against a minority group. So as such, entrenched discrimination against certain groups could be a contributing cause of people's differential exposure and vulnerability to climate change. And so this demonstrates the intersectionality of persecution and how climate change exacerbates existing vulnerabilities. But climate change in and of itself is unlikely, well, climate change and its impacts are unlikely to be sufficient to fulfill the Refugee Convention definition. Next slide, please. Given that then many people moving because of climate change won't fulfill the 51 Convention definition, should we develop an optional protocol or a new treaty to respond to climate change displacement? On the whole, I would say that this is not where current attention should be placed, and there are a number of challenges with creating a specific climate change displacement treaty. First is a technical problem. To have a climate change refugee convention, then climate change must be the cause of the displacement, such that causation must link the harm, so the displacement, with climate change. As I and Laura have already mentioned, establishing that climate change is and its impacts is the cause of the movement will be very difficult given the complex reasons why people move. Second, a convention focused solely on climate change-induced displacement could be restrictive and exacerbate existing inequalities because it will inevitably restrict who is protected. Only climate refugees who fulfill yet another technical definition and can prove causation will be granted protection. Any who cannot reach this technical threshold would be excluded. And so this will exacerbate existing and entrench new inequalities and will be dictated by how we define a climate refugee. Who and how should we decide who is in and out of that definition? Next, refugee protection is based on a perception and not a wholly accurate one that refugee status is temporary, that people will be able to return once the persecution has ceased. However, this is not so the case with displacement that's caused by climate change's impact. This may be permanent or it might be seasonal or circular. So provision of refugee status to these people won't fix the problem of climate displacement or the unequal effects of climate change that exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. Further, to get agreement of states on a new treaty, protection will inevitably be filtered down. And this is so because there is not a political will or appetite for a new binding refugee treaty. In order to get states to agree to this, the treaty will likely be drafted to provide much less protection than is currently available through existing frameworks that we're going to look at. So unlike refugeehood, which is often sudden, climate-induced displacement will be gradual and is localised. This means a few things. First, we can plan for it in a way we cannot with refugee movements. Second, where it does not concern a loss of state territory, as with the sinking island states, it will likely be circular or seasonal, and so movement to seek safety and job opportunities will also likely be circular. Third, in such circumstances, regional and national level approaches that are context specific are often better, as Laura's highlighted, than abstract international frameworks. So whilst discussions of the climate change displacement treaty demonstrate the importance and seriousness of the situation, what it can actually do is divert attention from where it's needed on focusing on local and regional arrangements that can create legal pathways for migration to respond to climate-induced movement. Attention is also needed on building adaptation and resilience, especially for those individuals and communities that are already vulnerable. Next slide, please, before I move on to Alice. So what is necessary then is an increase in access to legal pathways for migration that are open to all, not just the highly skilled, to ensure those who are most vulnerable have access to pathways to seek work within their country or region should they be forced to move due to climate change impacts. So regular labour migration, when in line with human rights and labour standards, can contribute to climate adaptation and development. These pathways can be in the form of visa liberalisation, so where states minimise visa requirements for short stays, and this can be useful for individuals seeking work. An alternative is labour mobility agreements, where states agree on pathways to seek work and individuals may travel without a visa to take up employment. And such agreements are already being utilised in the Pacific region, for example. There are also free movement regimes, as we've seen in the EU, where individuals are free to and will have to self-fare. Also, humanitarian visas is another avenue which would be provided to individuals based upon the humanitarian emergency and enable them to enter a country on humanitarian grounds. Any pathways for migration must be founded upon existing human rights law and be open to all skill levels to avoid entrenching inequalities. And individuals who access legal pathways should be protected by human rights and labour law to ensure equal and fair treatment, non-discrimination, access to basic services, and so forth. And in addition, for those who cross an international border, complementary protection can provide protection from return, so non-refoulement, which may prevent return to a state where a person is at a risk of cruel and inhumane treatment or their right to life is threatened. Obviously, the challenge with the application of human rights law for people who need to cross a border is this question of actually access these legal pathways, which may be discriminatory and exacerbate inequalities, because the likelihood is, if that's in practice, states will be more willing to take highly skilled and educated individuals. And as there is no right to enter any state, and without legal avenues, individuals may be forced to enter irregularly. However, soft law instruments are increasingly providing further guidance on this. The Global Compacts, the Guiding Principles, the Nansen Initiative, and the Sendai Framework all provide guidance on how to respond to displacement from climate change and provide a framework for how states should be better cooperating to share the responsibility of responding to all forms of displacement. But they do not create binding obligations on states. As such, there is a gap both in regards to legal accountability for people who have been displaced by climate change and for ensuring responsibility sharing. Alice is going to talk more about accountability and for climate change and its impacts. The final point I want to make is on this responsibility sharing. And this is another policy issue, is that states are just not willing to share in the responsibility for displacement. We see this for refugees, but it's also true for climate change-induced displacement. Under refugee law, responsibility is for the provision of protection. Responsibility sharing is about developed states, often supporting developing states through financial assistance or resettlement. Under climate law, the differentiation model sees that those who emitted the most have greater responsibility in regard to emissions targets and supporting developing states. So responsibility for climate change is linked with how much you contributed to it. And we don't see any kind of concept of this under refugee law at the moment. But interestingly, in the Torres Island decision, which has just come out from the Human Rights Committee, they stated that due diligence obligations on a state to mitigate and adapt the effects of climate change are greater on those states with more significant emissions. So my kind of parting question is whether we can learn from this kind of differentiation model and assign greater responsibility for climate change displacement to those states who have contributed the greatest emissions. Thank you, and I'll pass over to Alice now.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so just to pick up a little bit more on the international environmental law side and think about some of the solutions that international human rights law might offer in this context. From the perspective of climate law and climate policy, because of a lot of what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change does falls into the bracket of soft law and policy and strategy. There has been a shift, as Laura discussed previously, with climate change. The focus historically has been on mitigation and adaptation as sort of the two key pillars of climate action. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has reflected this through the development of targets for states to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, through the promotion of climate finance and adaptation support, through the Green Climate Fund, for example. And what was known as loss and damage had sort of been a fringe issue until a bit more recently. In 2013, we saw for the first time loss and damage, which is to say all of the impacts of climate change which cause loss of some kind, which cannot be addressed even if we are taking really ambitious mitigation and adaptation measures, and require an additional response. That has now been accounted for through what's called the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And that's there to address both economic losses, which is probably what we're more familiar with. We often hear, for example, about the GDP impacts of extreme weather events, Category 5 cyclones, causing extreme impact for particularly climate vulnerable states. And to give an example, I think it was estimated that Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu caused more than 60% loss in terms of GDP. Those losses are extremely significant, but it is also designed to address what we call non-economic loss. And non-economic loss is where displacement and the human impact of climate change really come into consideration. So within that bracket, there has been an increasing focus on climate change as a driver of displacement and the human rights impacts that displacement has on particularly vulnerable populations. And as a result of that, in COP21, where we saw the adoption of the Paris Agreement, we also saw the establishment of a task force on displacement, which is established within the auspices of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. So that's how it's being framed in international climate law. But the framing of that mechanism is quite careful. The framing of loss and damage has always been quite carefully considered in climate negotiations. It's often been a sticking point between developing states parties, because developed states are very reticent to put in place any legal duties or obligations, and particularly no duty to provide compensation for climate loss and damage. So that has been, for example, expressly excluded from the Paris Agreement text. And as such, we see that the framing of task force on displacement and the mandate that it's been given has been primarily focused on facilitating cooperation, on sharing knowledge and understanding, with the aim of encouraging states parties to develop their own laws and policies and strategies to address the impacts of climate migration and displacement, pointing them in the direction of funding support and generally being a place in which those conversations can happen. As I say, it's been quite carefully worded around facilitation of cooperation and not around legal obligation. And human rights are not embedded within that. So when we look at the climate treaties, what we have in place within the umbrella treaty itself, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and within the Paris Agreement, there are no legally binding obligations relating to climate migration. There is one reference to migration or migrants within the Paris Agreement preamble, which is the opening text treaty, which is not legally binding and which is framed around human rights obligations, interestingly, that states parties should, when taking climate action, take into consideration their respective human rights obligations of particularly climate vulnerable groups, and then lists a number of groups, including migrants. But as I say, this is really pitched as policy guidance and sort of safeguarding considerations in international climate law and policy. It's not pitched as something which gives rise to legally binding duties. And from a legal perspective and from a human rights perspective, I find this quite problematic because it's degrading the status of human rights from legally binding obligations and duties and entitlements to policy guidance, essentially. Next slide, please. So turning to alternative sources of legal duties outside of that climate law framework, we have the existing international human rights framework, as Catherine has already mentioned. And within that framework, we have 9 core human rights treaties, each with its own enforcement and monitoring provisions provided for by a committee. And also there are universal reporting obligations, which states are subject to. And it gives rise to a body of both procedural and substantive rights, many of which are really relevant in the context of climate change impacts. So by procedural rights, we, for example, would talk about your right to participate in democratic processes, to have a say in the environmental context, in environmental decision-making or decision-making around climate change, which is going to impact you, and thinking about your right to an effective remedy as a core provision there, which has been acknowledged by international human rights actors, is an important factor here to consider for those that are going to be subject to the worst impacts of climate change. On the substantive side, we think about our right to life, our right to an adequate standard of living, our right to health, our right to food, housing, water, sort of within that framework, our right to private life, our cultural rights, and also specialist provisions for those groups who we know, as a result of increasing research around the social impacts of climate change, are going to be subject to disproportionate burdens. And that includes women, for example. We have a treaty on the elimination of discrimination against women. It includes persons with disabilities, and there is a specialist treaty, again, relating to persons with disabilities within the human rights framework. And indeed the rights of children as well, because we know that this has a more significant impact on future generations, and also that children are more vulnerable to some of the worst impacts of climate change. And that includes human rights impacts arising in the context of climate displacement, and the risks posed to those groups in displacement situations. So within the international human rights framework, we have opportunities to hold states to account, both through soft mechanisms and through complaints mechanisms. And so I'd like to talk a bit about the role of both of those. Next slide, please. So within that context of either specialist human rights treaties or the broader-based treaties, UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights being two of sort of the key umbrella treaties in international human rights law. Specialist committees provide for monitoring. States that sign up to them have to issue reports on the way in which rights have been implemented within their states, any particular risks to rights, and will receive feedback from the committee. The committees are responsible for monitoring compliance with human rights, and part of their remit also includes receiving complaints and issuing recommendations on the basis of the complaints that they receive. It's worth flagging at this juncture that engagement with these mechanisms is very much dependent on political will and also on institutional capacity and resourcing. And that is a particular issue in climate vulnerable developing states. So states need to have signed up to the specific international human rights treaty, and also often to optional protocols associated with that treaty in order for their citizens to have access to these complaint mechanisms. And as you can imagine, with 9 international human rights treaties, all with their own reporting requirements, this is a very heavy bureaucratic burden for governments to bear, particularly those governments that may already have constraints in terms of resourcing institutional capacity. And as such, these complaints mechanisms aren't always available, and initiatives like capacity building, which are provided for by UN framework through the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for example, and also through climate finance initiatives and climate capacity building, are really important in terms of enabling access to some of these mechanisms. That being said, where these mechanisms are available and states have ratified the relevant treaties and optional protocols, recent jurisprudence and decisions from human rights committees have illustrated that they can play a really significant role in developing legal responses to climate change, and also in the context of displacement risk, and in helping to further legal doctrine as well, because we know that existing legal doctrines aren't really very well adapted to addressing global environmental challenges like climate change. So given a couple of examples here, so the UN Human Rights Committee, which is responsible for monitoring compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, received a complaint from Mr. Taitiota, who is a resident of Kiribati, and brought a complaint against New Zealand because the New Zealand government had turned down his claim for asylum. And that claim was based on right to life grounds and the direct and indirect impact of climate change in Kiribati, which is a particularly low-lying Pacific Island nation, and the impacts there of rising sea levels, of sea inundation of the soil, salinization, was causing water shortages, was exacerbating land disputes, violent land disputes, and accordingly, he claimed that his right to life was violated by New Zealand when he was returned to Kiribati and his claim for asylum was denied. And although the Human Rights Committee found that there was not an immediate enough risk to his right to life, they did acknowledge that the severity of the threat posed in countries like Kiribati, where ultimately with projected sea level rise, it may become completely uninhabitable in the future, pose a serious risk to the enjoyment of the right to life and dignity, and that the requisite threshold for a violation of human rights may be reached before that risk is fully realised. So it left the door open to future claims. And we've also seen claims come before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. A number of claimants banded together in Sachi in Argentina, communication here, and there it was argued that climate impacts were having and going to have a really significant effect on the rights of children from a number of different states around the world, particularly their enjoyment of cultural and their right to life. And even though this was dismissed on fairly narrow procedural grounds as being inadmissible because the petitioners hadn't exhausted all of the domestic remedies, the committee took the opportunity to explore this and acknowledged that climate change represented a significant threat to the rights of children, both now and into the future, to the right to health, food, housing, and cultural rights, and took the opportunity to acknowledge that states have obligations to protect against impacts that their pollution was going to cause for children in other states. So what we might call in legal terms extraterritorial obligations, which is really significant development of the existing legal doctrine, which has often been framed quite narrowly, so human rights would apply within the territory of the state that has signed up to the treaty. and they'd opened the door to a much wider application of international human rights law to acknowledge the fact that climate change is a transboundary problem, that states who are contributing to the build-up of greenhouse gas emissions will be responsible for the human rights impacts of citizens elsewhere in the world. And we need to develop the existing doctrine that we have to address climate change appropriately. And then even more encouragingly, as Catherine already mentioned, very recently, the Human Rights Committee issued a decision on a communication brought by a group of islanders, Australian nationals from the Torres Islands, Indigenous nationals of the Torres Islands. And those nationals were arguing that Australia's failure to adequately implement ambitious mitigation and adaptation measures to address climate change impacts, and that included things like renewing seawalls, but also more fundamentally inadequate mitigation targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, had contributed to a violation of their cultural rights, because their enjoyment of culture within those islands was being significantly impacted. Their lands were being inundated by tidal surges. Flooding was having a negative impact on their ability to sustain themselves through traditional farming and fishing methods, for example. And those impacts, it was acknowledged by the Human Rights Committee, could lead to a violation of the enjoyment of their cultural rights and their enjoyment of private life and family life. And as such, the committee advised that those individuals should be compensated, that Australia should look to consult with communities to address their needs more appropriately, and should ultimately be taking more ambitious measures to address climate change, which is a really significant step forward in international law and international law's capacity to address climate change and the impact for particularly climate vulnerable groups at that level. Although, thanks very much.
Alice, could I ask you to wrap up, please? Sorry,
of course, yeah.
You short. Thanks.
Can we move on to the last slide, please? So, although these communications aren't binding, they do have a significant impact in terms of development of underlying legal pathways. And we can see the way in which these may trickle down into the development of regional human rights responses and regional policy responses to climate change and the impacts of displacement. And also down to the national level, particularly where an individual state has been advised by a UN human rights body to enact certain measures. There's a lot of fiscal pressure to implement measures in these types of situations. We can see that the development of climate change displacement solutions faces a number of different legal challenges and policy challenges, and that is true even in light of some of these advances. But there is significant potential that we can use some of these international responses innovatively and use a combination of different responses using soft law, as Catherine mentioned, alongside perhaps international human rights law, in order to better address some of these challenges moving into the future. And thanks, I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry I had to intervene. It's fascinating, and I wish we had more time. I'd like to make sure that everyone has time at the end for question and answers, and perhaps you could expand on some of the points then as well. So thank you, that was so thorough and informative. Could I just turn now to Tom Dixon, who can talk about some of the realities on the ground in the local area in Bristol, and the role of ACH in working with refugees in our local area. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm Tom. I'm the research and project lead at ACH. So just very brief background on me. So I've worked in the refugee and asylum sector for about 10 or 11 years, predominantly for ACH, but also for a couple of other organizations. I spent around 7 or 8 years doing frontline support work, working with refugee service users, and moved into more of a research role a few years ago. So in terms of ACH, I think most people on this call are probably familiar with broadly what we do, but in terms of some of our work around climate change, around 7 or 8 years ago, we started working with our residents in Bristol, educating them around climate change and also preparing them for when they move on for our accommodation, things that they can do to both mitigate the costs of their bills, but also reduce their climate impact. And over the last couple of years, that has moved on to some more substantial projects, more substantial work, which I'll touch on at the end of this presentation. So if we could have the next slide, please. So I think kind of some of this follows on from what the previous speakers have said, but I think an important point is that for us in the West, or for us particularly in the UK, the impacts of climate change can feel quite abstract and feel quite distant still. Whereas for the refugee, for the vulnerable migrant service users that we work with at ACH, those impacts are immediate, may have impacted on them already, are impacting on friends and family that remain back in their countries of origin, and are continuing to have those impacts. Now, I think it's important to note that a lot of the individuals that we work with may not frame their experience in terms of climate change. They may not attribute it directly to climate change. They may not be cognizant of the fact that climate change has led to their experiences, or has indirectly led to their experience because of the general pressures of life. But I think, as we'll see later in this presentation, that this is very much the case. Could we have the next slide, please? So yeah, just sort of some of the current climate change impacts. So obviously increased food competition, difficulty in accessing clean water, desertification, famine, and land degradation. These are all things that are very real and very current impacts on a lot of the countries of origin of the individuals that we work with. These obviously act to create, in some cases, or to exacerbate existing conflict, existing violence, ultimately forcing people to flee their homes. For more current example, obviously we had an incredibly hot summer here. We had incredibly hot summer globally. This led to a drought in Somalia, and there's now a significant risk of Somalia going into famine in the next sort of few weeks, few months. Again, this is creating introducing additional instability into what is already a quite febrile, difficult situation. Another kind of more anecdotal example that I wanted to give, I remember a couple of years ago talking with one of our Sudanese tenants in Bristol about how he was having to increase the amount of money he was sending back to his family who remained in Sudan. Again, because there had been a drought in Sudan, the crops had failed, the family was struggling. This was directly impacting him and his standard of living in the UK, as he was essentially supporting more and more people back home who were unable to support themselves because of those impacts of climate change. Can we have the next climate change? The next slide, please. Sorry. Cool. So I wanted to kind of touch a bit on the kind of standard or what is often in kind of response to climate change in the UK. There tends to be a focus on what we can do as individuals, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but a focus on increasing the volume of recycling we do, driving less, flying less, having smaller families, this kind of individual action. Now, we commissioned, as part of our climate change project with the National Lottery, the Centre for Sustainable Energy produced a report on the carbon footprints of our service users, our residents in our Bristol properties, and found they were 70% lower than the Bristol average. So, I mean, that was kind of a surprise even to us. We thought that they would be lower, but perhaps not by that significant a margin. And I think that the people that we're working with, and not just people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, but people more generally in lower income households, are often contributing the least towards climate change. And I think some of the discourse around that and the interaction with those individuals can be at risk of becoming patronizing when going into these people's houses, asking them to recycle more, when you or I or people from middle class backgrounds may be flying abroad 3 times a year for holidays, which is not something they're doing. We may be driving our cars, which is not something that they're doing. So I think that the kind of focus of that intervention needs to be more closely put on those who are contributing the most to climate change, as opposed to those who are contributing the least. Another kind of specific example around that, there's a group recently started up in Lawrence Hill of mothers around the air quality in Lawrence Hill. Now, if you look at demographic data for Bristol, Lawrence Hill has some of the lowest car ownership numbers for the city. That clean air in that particular council ward, or the lack of clean air in that particular council ward, is created by individuals driving their cars through to commute to work every day. So again, on a very micro kind of local level, you can see again, as we saw at the global level, that those who are contributing the least are feeling some of the worst effects of that air pollution and that impact on the climate. If we could have the next slide, please. So some of our most recent work around climate is funded through the National Lottery, the Community Climate Action Fund. So we were one of 6 partner organisations working with other community groups in Bristol. So some of them I can see are on this call. So we worked with Bristol Disability Equalities Forum, Heart of BS13, and a number of other sort of community organisations representing different less economically advantaged groups in the city. So as part of our stage 1 work, we went out to refugee communities, both our service users and kind of more widely, and looked at, what they thought about climate change. We didn't necessarily frame the conversations directly around climate change, but in a more kind of general discussion. And I think there was a couple of things that came out of it. There was an equitable access to green employment. So I think something that's also not touched on often is that the move towards a greener country, the move towards a greener society also brings with it opportunities, brings with it economic opportunity and opportunities for employment. And those sectors, those organizations tend to be very kind of white, very middle class, very graduate. So we wanted to work on ways to support individuals that we work with to access those organizations, which then has the additional benefit of diversifying the conversation around climate change and making the work of those organizations more accessible and more reflective of the diversity of the city. So that's kind of, and again, as part of our stage 1 work, we produced a set of training resources which are available online as a kind of introduction to green employment for non-native speakers and individuals from refugee and migrant communities. So earlier this summer, the project was funded again by the lottery. You can see there for £2.1 million for another 3 or 4 years, again working with the same partners. So we're moving now into the delivery of the second stage of that project. So we have kind of 2 main components of the work that we'll be doing over that period. So one is supporting the refugee and vulnerable migrant communities to access green employment, green sector employment. So we're linking up with employers, we're providing training and putting people directly into roles in that way. And then we are also supporting both pre-existing and new refugee and migrant-led small business to consider their climate impact and to look at ways in which they can make their organizations more environmentally friendly and more reduce the carbon footprint of their organizations. Next slide, please. Is there a next slide? That might be the last slide. Ah, that was the last slide. Wonderful. So yes, I think that's the answer. I'll hand back to David and Anne for sum up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, and to all the speakers. The amount of information and insights that we've been exposed to there has been really marvellous. So I'm handing over the task of summarising and bringing out some of the threads to David, and then we'll move into a session for question and answer and comments. And I can already see in the chat we've several useful links and contributions, so I'm sure we're going to have a rich discussion. But first, let's hear from David about what you think is significant that we need to think about in those presentations.
Yeah. I don't want to take up too much time because I think we have limited time left, and I want to give as much opportunity, discussion, questions, and further information. But it seems to me quite often in these sort of very interesting seminars, specifically coming from a research perspective, you can, if you're not careful, end up with the conclusion that the causes and drivers behind, I know some people don't like the word drivers, the causes behind some things are so complicated and require so much research and analysis that nothing can be done about it. And I always sort of find that to be a little bit of a problem or an issue, because I think concluding that nothing can be done about it is not at all appropriate. So within the complexity that's just been described, I think it would be good if during the discussion and the questions and the further interaction, we can look at what actions can be taken. And in the discussion, which the presentations from Laura, from Catherine, from Alice, and from Tom, firstly sort of distinguish between the whole issue of mitigating climate change and trying to reduce it or stop it or slow it down, and adapting to it, which is to prepare our institutions, our infrastructures, our populations, our processes to absorb and to reduce the impact of climate change on people as it happens. And that dichotomy, I think, is an important part of the context. And also, four contributions, also illustrating the complexity of how the role of international level, but very much came of Alice Catherine's presentation, and what happens at very local level from Tom, describing the fact that many of our refugee and migration clients actually produce far less carbon footprint than the average resident. So we focusing on them, looking for solutions, and to what extent those actions can be, whether it's about mitigation or adaptation, can those solutions be generated at different levels, and particularly from our point of view, what can be done at local, regional level to help in terms of adaptation and mitigation, which would be realistic and something that can be achieved. And another thing I thought that came out is the dichotomy, if you want, between refugees and migrants. And I take, of course, all of the points of view from Alice, legal context, but from my point of view, the difference between refugees and migrants ought to be there in functional terms often is not as straightforward as it would seem. So we've been doing work recently with the big issue about the Romanian Roma community in Bristol, who are definitely not refugees, but on the other hand, they are in many ways suffering from the same levels of persecution and intimidation and poor treatment that refugees would be considered having. So, you know, the difference between refugees and migrants and how that evolves over time, based on a legal framework which was put together in the immediate period after the Second World War. How does that work internationally? But we can't change that. But how can we work within that context locally and regionally to improve the lives of those people? And I think also there's perhaps from an ACH point of view, we have an approach which is called rethinking refugee. And what that basically is supposed to convey is that on the one hand, there's a sort of a right-wing sort of strong state solution, which is that we need to control our borders, we need to make sure we know who's coming in, and people who are not coming in, we throw them out, and we have to have a sort of draconian approach to how we control both refugee and migrant flows, and that's sort of strong state of populist rights argument. But there's also a sort of liberal lefty perspective, which is refugees and migrants, they're poor people, not just in terms of income, but in terms of their characteristics. They need help, they need to be helped out, and then our charity cases. Our approach would be set to refugees and migrant communities and individuals. They're all different circumstances, they're not all the same. Having a sort of uniform approach doesn't work. and that they are basically assets for our society. Remember one Lisbon event I went to said cities especially are about innovation. Innovation comes from diversity. Without innovation and diversity, we might as well give up, close down and stop functioning. So I think the idea that we regard refugees and migrants as assets, as contributors, the idea of people moving about is a good idea. Obviously, if they have to move about for negative reasons, that may not be a good idea. We may need to look at how that happens. We also need to change the narrative, the overall narrative behind refugee and integration and resettlement, and as well as the attitude to migrants. So from our points of view, I think this has been a very useful seminar, because clearly climate change and migration are two of the great issues in the world at the moment, and both at the national and local level. So it's really important to see how they interact. In practical terms, we will send out the slides and the materials to everybody who signed up, whether they actually arrived in the event or not. We'll also do a blog from people's contributions, and we will circulate that through our social media and other outlets, both through MMB and through ACH. And we have a joint web page, which we'll also use to distribute that information. And we would be very happy to sustain and maintain a sort of network and contact between people if people are willing to do that. And I think you all got our contact details. People can post that in the chat if they wish. And I hope this won't be just a one-off event, but we all go away and feel good about our world. It does lead to some change in focus and change of approach.
So thank you.
Thanks also to Anne for chairing it, and also to Rosie, who's done all the technology, without whom none of this would be happening.